So hi everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Ophir Gutelzon, leading Unacceptable from Palo Alto, California. And today co-hosting with me is Shimrit Brown Kamin. Hi Shimrit, say hi. We are going to have a special guest today, and Dahlia and Asaf is already here with us, so I'm going to present them in a second. We are going to talk today as we are months into the war, and 50 hostages are still not home, and innocent civilians continue to suffer in Gaza. We just woke up this morning here in the West Coast and probably in the East Coast and in the afternoon in Israel to saw the IDF strike on the hospital in Khan Yunis. Prime Minister already apologized for that, but we're going to talk about why it's so easy, why it feels so easy now for us to look into those actions, and it's make us feel so bad on one hand. On the other hand, it's seems to be going through in the Israeli point of view more easily than before. There was also 5 journalists that were killed and paramedics who came to rescue the people inside, and yet the Israel leadership offers no end game, talking openly about decades of war. If you haven't seen the clips we've translated from Drucker and Neria Krauss, Ravi Drucker and Neria Krauss about the sabotaging the deal. It is on our YouTube channel. Endless war corrades with our democracy and empowers fundamentalism and hardens public opinion against equality. So tonight, or today, we will examine 3 alarms we see right now in Israel Jewish discourse. The hardline resistance to ceasefire and hostage deal, diminishing empathy for Gazan civilian death, and open advocacy for transfer and ethnic cleansing. And we'll explore what this means for Israel's future, for the Jewish worldwide, and even for the day after Netanyahu, that at some point will come. Joining us today is Dr. Asaf David on identity and institutions, and Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin on public opinion and social psychology. Dr. Asaf David, hi Asaf, say hi to everyone.
Hi, everyone.
Is a leading political scientist focusing on the Middle East and Israel, Palestine. He is the co-founder and academic director of the Forum for Regional Thinking and the head of the Israel and Middle East Department in the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. And since October 7th, he has also been one of the few Israelis who are in touch with people in Gaza and bringing their voices from there to the Israeli public. I know Asaf is writing a lot in Hebrew. He's on Facebook, so I suggest truly to follow him. And Asaf, this week is also marking your 30th year since you survived the terror attack in Bus in Jerusalem. So thank you for being with us here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin is a political scientist and is a leading pollster and public opinion expert and an Haaretz columnist. You probably read her a lot. She has worked on 9 national campaigns in Israel in 15 other countries, and is the author of The Crook Timber of Democracy in Israel. And she is now a visiting professor in UPenn, right?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me.
So we will start, and we will start with a conversation that is a question to start with just giving like a couple of minutes for both of you, Asaf and Dahlia, to explain how do you see the situation right now as we are in like almost 19 months, almost 20 months to the war. And how do you see the public discourse right now in Israel? Asaf, we'll start with you, and then Dalia will move to you back.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Asking for a definition of a political regime from scholars and intellectuals is usually what we do in academia. But as you know, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And the weakest link of any given system provide valuable inside information. So perhaps we should turn to Israel's weakest link for an informed evaluation of the country's nature. And Israel, by its own definition, is a Jewish and democratic country. And therefore, its weakest link are Arab Palestinian citizens. For example, Ahmad Tibi, a seasoned member of Knesset, admits that indeed that Israel is Jewish and democratic, Jewish for Arabs and democratic for Jews. And in recent years, one might add, Israel has become even more Jewish and less democratic, for both its Jewish and Arab citizens. But the weakest links feel the change and fear it more than the strongest, stronger links. So while Israeli Jews enjoy both citizenship and nationality, Israeli Arabs enjoy only citizenship, but are excluded from Israeli nationality. And in fact, there is no Israeli nationality. Israel's Supreme Court, presumably the champion of liberal values, has consistently rejected the concept of an Israeli nationality as distinct from citizenship. In a landmark decision on October 2013, it denied a request to recognize Israeli as a nationality, asserting that while all citizens are classified as Israeli for citizenship, their nationality is defined by ethnic and religious groups. It also reaffirmed a previous decision which held that there was no evidence of an Israeli nationality formed separately from Jewish nationality. So those who failed to understand the meaning of this division of labor between citizenship and nationality in Israel were giving a strong answer 5 years later. The nation-state law enacted by the Knesset in July 2018 establishes Israel as a nation-state of the Jewish people. And by emphasizing only the Jewish right to self-determination and promoting Jewish settlement as a national value, it legitimized discrimination against Palestinians. Now, Zionists perceive Israel as a democratic country. Center and left-wing supporters would argue that Israel is a democracy going astray, although they will reject the superiority of its democratic nature over its Jewish nature. But, Minister Miri Regev, for example, said that there were many democratic states in the world, but only one Jewish state. So according to this popular view, not only Jewish supremacy trumps democratic values in Israel, but even the Zionist left is a looming danger. And therefore, and I conclude in that, a Jewish nation state entails a religious and exclusionary interpretation of the word Jewish. Now, in a country that is dominated by religion, the sovereign is God and not the citizen. And therefore, in Israel, and people would say that in some sort of Hegelian transformation or Hegelian process of Israeli and Zionist makeup, is that what began as Jewish and democratic ended as Jewish point. And that's the situation which we're in right now in Israel.
And that's basically what we're going to kind of like dive deep into is how do we turn from it? I mean, and I heard you saying in the past that Jewish, I mean, it used to be secular Jewish and democratic because that's our founding father in a way started the country, and now it's becoming Jewish point or messianic theocracy or fundamentalist. Dalia, what do you see from the polls? Like, how do we ended up, or what is it really what it's looked like that we are becoming more the fundamentalism, Jewish fundamentalism is becoming more mainstream?
I'm going to say something that maybe you won't appreciate hearing, but I think Jewish fundamentalism in the theological sense, the streams of thought affiliated with the most extreme forms of Jewish messianic fundamentalism, are really just an add-on They are an additional factor that has played into the deepest contradictions that have led us to where we are now. So let me just start with where I think we are now with public opinion. Briefly, we know that there's a paradox. The majority of Israelis consistently, from pretty much from early in the war, but even more consistently in 2025, are against what the government is doing, right? The majority want the war to be over for the sake of the hostage release. The majority do not think that the current operation in Gaza, the current expansion and attack on or attempt to surround and occupy Gaza City is going to bring the hostages back. On major things, the majority is against the government, particularly the vast majority of Israeli Jews want ultra-Orthodox to be drafted. The vast majority of the entire population wants a commission of inquiry. The majority, not huge, but a consistent majority for years has been against the judicial overhaul. So on many aspects, the majority of the population, by public opinion research, is consistently against what this government is doing. On the other hand, we also know that they are not supporting an end to the war out of concern for the situation of Palestinians in Gaza. And I think there's a very in-depth mechanism for why that concern for Gazans is not playing a role here. And we can talk about it, I think, in the question and answer, mostly because of the hostages and the soldiers' fate. But the bigger problem is that Israel elected this leadership. Okay, now, I always have to footnote that because only 48.3% of the voters actually elected the party in this government, but they were legitimately elected according to Israel's electoral system. And under this leadership, the current trajectory, or something like it, with or without October 7th, was inevitable. And not only that, I think that this government is very, we often say it's the most extreme government in Israel's history. It's, characterized by the religious fundamentalism that we're talking about. But I would say this government itself is a natural and inevitable outgrowth of Israel's refusal throughout the course of its history to decide formally what it wants to do with the occupied territories, while on the ground always deciding on deepening occupation, greater expansion and suppression of Palestinian self-determination, and not to ignore all of the pitfalls within the negotiation rounds that happened and all of the rejectionism from the Palestinian leadership as well. That plays a role, absolutely. But Israel's commitment has always been to continue, other than those moments of negotiations, has continued to be expansion of the situation. And I think that commitment would always inevitably have turned into a clash over the viability of democratic institutions, because the occupation is an undemocratic project. Nobody claims otherwise. And it is flowing from the very same state institutions that are Israeli society, that is the Israeli state. The idea that it was a separate regime has always been a fiction. I think it's not, internalized enough. And how do I know that that is not sufficiently internalized? Because we had the biggest democracy uprising of the history of the country in support of democracy in 2023, well before this war. And nobody made the connection, or those who made the connection and said, this is largely because of the contradiction between occupation policies, which this government is advancing, and the government recognizing its need to undermine democratic institutions. That's why this is happening. Those people were essentially purposely shut out of the conversation, and Israelis refused to make that connection. And as long as they would not make that connection, the space would be open for the government to try to capitalize on basically tolerance or support for expanding Israel's territorial control and undermining Palestinian self-determination. And that would inevitably lead to the clash over democracy. And that would inevitably eventually lead to further escalation with the Palestinians, the longer that went on, in whatever form it would have taken. And so I think that everything we're seeing now is, I'm not going to say it was predictable, but some version of this contradiction would have always led to further escalations of violence, further undermining of democracy in Israel, and the form it took, and it was accelerated and helped by the stream of religious fundamentalism that we're seeing. I don't think the religious fundamentalism per se is what's becoming mainstream, but all those supporting long-term forces have enabled it to take a place of incredible influence over Israeli policy.
So when we look when we look into the reality is that we never had like an extremist as the finance minister. We never had an extremist as the head of the police. We never had so much budget going to rebuild the decisive plan for that Smotrich really writing the only plan for what the future would look like. So in that way, I mean, like when we look about Jewish fundamentalism coming to the mainstream, it seems like it's never happened before, and I mean, it sounds like Netanyahu in many ways are capitalizing on that sense. I mean, we always feel like he is hostage of the extremist, and he is kind of like trying to he's like the good guy. But he defined this notion of called total victory. It wasn't like Smotrich or Ben Gvir, and it's in a way the one thing that keeps us not bringing the hostages back. It's like the excuse for continuing the war. But is total victory is a term that is something that the Israeli population is accepting because it's becoming less democratic, or do you feel like is a term that is just going to be something that we'll need to live with because the population in Israel really wants to defeat Hamas, and that's the only way they see that it can happen?
Well, before I comment on the total victory issue, I want to refer to something that you said earlier, which I think is very important to understand and to differentiate between what we say for analytical reasons and what we say for political reasons. I think that the idea that Jewishness or Jewish nationality in Israel was ever secular is wrong. I think that the very idea that basing the country, the Israeli nation state, on the combination of religion and democracy was wrong. And I think that it wasn't the Jewish nationality that was becoming more religious, but it was the religion, the Jewish religion that was becoming more national or nationalistic over time in Israel. So the problem is whether this is a country for all or a state that for all its citizens, or is it a state for Jews? Because if it's a state for Jews, then the ultimate arbiter of what is Jewish is the halakha, and so it's God. So this is what we see basically happening in Israel now. The idea of total victory is, we can go back to the idea of managing the conflict, for example, which replaced the quest for solving the conflict, which was in the scene under the center to left wing governments in Israel. But when it was replaced by the idea of managing the conflict, then the right wing in Israel has a very strong and persuasive political imagination of what is a Jewish and democratic, or a Jewish state. And a Jewish state is a state with no Arabs. And since Israel has no borders and has no restrictions and is controlling the West Bank like forever, then it also means that between the river and the sea, there should be no Arabs. There might be Arabs, but they cannot be Palestinians. They cannot be national Palestinians. They cannot be national part of the national Palestinian movement. And therefore, the total victory is not about Jewish solidarity, because we could make the case for Jewish solidarity and bring the hostages back home. That's also a Jewish notion. But the Jewish notion means no Arabs between the river and the sea. So the Smotrich plan, תוכנית ההכרעה, how would we translate
The decisive.
It's not really decisive, right?
The plan for defeat. The plan for defeat.
The plan for defeat, yeah, it's a total defeat of Palestinians. A total defeat of Palestinians, a total victory. And a total victory means no Hamas. No Hamas means no Gazans, because Hamas was part of Gaza and Gaza was part of Hamas. If you cannot differentiate between Hamas and non-combatants and civilians, then ethnic cleansing is what you do. And this is what Israel does.
But his plan was referring mostly to the West Bank, which was actually written before October 7 and during this engagement, no?
I think that I think the plan is that there will be no sovereignty other than Jewish sovereignty between the river and the sea.
Between the river and the sea, including Gaza.
Between the river and the sea.
And it was
So,
written in 2017 or published in 2017.
Yeah. So, you can do, everybody thought about the West Bank as the front, because nobody thought about Gaza. Israel thought that it somehow, solved the Gaza problem. It didn't solve the Gaza problem. And what we see now happening at the West Bank is basically the second Gaza, because we're up for ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, and that is part of the defeat plan of Smotrich. And right now, the left wing in Israel has no political imagination or a persuasive or convincing political imagination that is not right wing, and that's that's the nightmare that we're living in Israel-Palestine right now.
And Dalia, I mean, like when Asaf is saying the left in Israel doesn't have imagination, the definition of the left right now is the most left that we can think of is Yair Golan, I assume. And in many ways, people outside of Israel think that everyone that was on the streets against the judicial overhaul, right, was left to Netanyahu. Right? I mean, like, so maybe we can make a claim around that. And I would also add just something that Asaf said about the Jewish secular and others. I mean, until I moved outside of Israel, I only consider myself an Israeli. The Jewish definition came later when I came outside of Israel. And I don't know if many Israelis like me feels like that in Israel. I mean, what I call the secular. But in that context, I mean, like, what do you see on the political side? I mean, what is left, and what does it look like?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, the idea of left, first of all, among the political class, because you started out saying maybe the only left winger is Yair Golan. Let's not forget that we have, robust political parties who represent Palestinian citizens or Arab citizens of Israel who would count as what we used to consider left, which is supporting a two-state solution through negotiations and peaceful, parallel self-determination. And they continue to support those positions. Do they place, not all of those parties have always prioritized that, right? Mahmoud Abbas made a decision not to prioritize it when he went into the government, but we know that's what they stand for. They continue to stand for it. And so let's not, reinforce the tendency of our prime minister to just erase the Arab or Palestinian politics in Israel.
Jewish Israelis. No,
I know. I'm not saying you're doing it, but I'm just saying it's very easy to, discount them because of the assumption that they won't be part of a government. But that's politics. I want us to still at least acknowledge that they exist. In terms of the public, however, when you say what counts as left, for one thing, I can give you a few numbers. The people who define themselves as left, and my first priority is to respect what people think of themselves before I analyze what it means. So when we ask people, do you consider yourself to be center, left, or right? We get about 20%, sometimes 22%, 23%, sometimes 18 or 19%, but about 20% who identify as left wing among the total population. When you weight Jews and Arabs together, when you look just at the Jewish population, that number is between 12 and 14% of the Jewish population. But what's interesting is that it has not changed significantly since October 7th. It did. After October 7th, it went down. It even went below 10%. But then it recovered back to where it was for about 5 years at least, if not more, 10 years before the war. That same, 12 to 14% range. So many people kind of came back to where they were after October 7th, before October 7th. And in terms of what they mean by it, this is where it gets tricky because parts of the center, right, another 25%, agree with the left on some basic things. For example, many of those centrists, for many years, 2/3 of those self-defined centrists supported a two-state solution, opposed settlements, supported many of the items in a two-state, negotiation. That the center changes during the war, right? Because they're much more flexible about their opinions. They change their mind more easily. But the left is defined, or has been defined for many years, by exactly the issues of the conflict. That is, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the axis on which center, left, and right ideology is based. And I mean, when somebody says I'm right wing or left wing in Israel, among the Jewish population in particular, but also among the Arab population, what they mean is their attitudes towards the Israeli-Palestinian issue, whether it's the conflict itself, the occupation, settlements, negotiations, two-state solution, annexation, or whether it's about identity. As Asaf was saying, this is a state primarily for Jews, Jewish identity, national identity, in opposition to anybody else, but particularly Palestinians. And that is the basic breakdown. In recent years, we have a new breakdown, two new breakdowns. One is for or against Netanyahu, but you shouldn't really take it into account when we're talking about the direction of the country, because even people who are against Netanyahu can hold hardline positions, of course, on the Israeli-Palestinian axis. Many of them do. And the other one is the democracy issue. So we do have 55% who always rejected the assault on the judiciary, even before Yariv Levin presented it, because we've been testing these issues for some years. And it's very consistent. There's always a majority against it. It's way more than the 20% who consider themselves to be left-wing. And yet in Israel today, all of those people would be considered left of Netanyahu. And the fact that they have not connected the issue of an assault on the judiciary as a necessary step towards advancing annexationist goals means that they will never really reconcile. I mean, unless they make that change, they can't make that change. But right now we have those different axes that have come to define left, right, and center, whereas it used to be a very simple one axis of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
I would take that and turn it into the question that we wanted to discuss, Asaf, about them against us, and in a way that we are looking into the majority of population. I think I saw the last poll from today from Accord, right, where almost 2/3 of the Israeli population doesn't feel moral obligation to what's happening in Gaza. And on the same time, I mean, this is confused with all the other number, because many of us want democracy and many of us wants to go, right, are going to the streets to because we care about, we're saying we want to end the war because we care more about lives than land, right? I mean, that's why the majority took to the streets. So maybe you can go deep into that. I mean, understanding of like how long of this how has the long history of the conflict and the idea of us vs them made people care less about the suffering of civilians in Gaza. And I want actually to connect it. It almost feels like there was a pogrom in Ra'anana and people didn't care, right? Against Reform Jews. I mean, like it's splitting into other places in Israel. But let's talk about the Gaza in that sense.
You know, I want to remind us of a very significant op-ed that was published on September 1967, namely just a couple of months after the occupation of the West Bank, by a small radical leftist group called Matzpen. And it said, "Our right to defend ourselves from extermination does not give us the right to oppress others. Occupation entails foreign rule. Foreign rule entails resistance. Resistance entails repression. Repression entails terror and counter-terror. And the victims of terror are mostly innocent people." That was written in September 1967. And because of the fact that we Jewish Israelis did not understand or accept that Jewish expansion, by the way, also inside Israel, inside the Green Line, but mostly, obviously, beyond the Green Line. Jewish expansionism and settlements means, by definition, resistance. And resistance means repression, and repression means terrorism. And we didn't accept that. And there was, you know, a small tiny window in history in the mid-90s where a government of Israel tried or accepted the Palestinian nationalism and tried to solve the conflict, whether it was, going to end with a Palestinian state or Palestinian self-rule, doesn't matter right now. But the continuous process by which we Jewish Israelis, Israeli media, Israeli politics, Israeli to some extent even Israeli academia treated the Palestinians as less than humans. It dehumanized Palestinians. It did not accept the fact that we are part of this cycle of violence because of expansionism and dispossession, which leads to repression and terrorism. And the end was with the disengagement from Gaza. By disengaging from Gaza 18 or so years ago, or 20 years ago, we basically put the Palestinians, especially in Gaza, beyond a wall, and we thought that nothing existed behind this wall. And there was, a whole community that was besieged by Israel, true, also by Egypt, true, but was besieged by Israel, and we dictated, the amount of calories that went in, and we just put him in the largest open air prison between the river and the sea. And when you put a person in a prison for such a long time, when he breaks out of the prison, you get a very, very nasty event. And that event in and of itself, the horrors and terrible things that happened and war crimes that happened on 7th of October in southern Israel is still part of trauma, which this government is against us recovering from this trauma. And this prolonged war, is part of the Netanyahu regime desire to leave Israelis and Israeli Jews especially inside this trauma and not heal and not recover from the trauma. And we have hostages there. They don't take the hostages out, although they could make a deal. We know that for a fact by now, that the Netanyahu regime resisted all the deals that were proposed by Hamas. We knew the price. The price is not easy. We know the price, but it resisted to make this deal. And this is part of leaving Israeli Jewish people in the trauma, so as not to resolve this conflict and lead to an ethnic cleansing of Gaza.
And you feel like this is the reason why Israelis are becoming, it's a leadership issue in many ways that brings the Israelis to care less about what's happening. And that's a question, and that's also a segue to Dahlia in that sense. And you can answer that if you want, Asaf. I feel like, again, in theory, the government is not controlling the media, right? In theory, the government is not controlling the social media. And again, it's all connected back to democracy in many ways. But the trauma is there. And the question, maybe Dahlia, to you is like, why do we see that evolving even more, even after almost 2 years? We definitely see more people care about ending the wars than we saw 6 months ago. I think that the last deal, that when the last deal was canceled, I feel like there was sabotage by Netanyahu. People really came out to the streets more. Is it connected to democracy and degradation of democracy? Kids who grow up, who go to the army now, only know Netanyahu in many ways, right?
So there's a few questions in that question. Yes, first of all, I can affirm that not just when the deal was broken, but from January, when the deal was signed, we had over 70% of Israelis who wanted the deal to continue to its final stage, which would have been a permanent ceasefire and full hostage release. The numbers can vary between 65 and 70%, but for the most part, there's always been a firm majority, and there are more surveys reaching over the 70% mark in 2025 than in the previous parts of the war. So your sense is correct, and that's an overwhelming majority. When you ask if it's leadership driven, though, when we talk about the lack of empathy or the moral justifications for what's going on in Gaza, I think that, yes, it is certainly, in a way, we have two theories in ethnic conflict, or various theories, but two of the theories are that, much of the ethnic incitement that leads to ethnic cleansing and war crimes is top-down, jingoistic, really ethnic entrepreneurs capitalizing on these worst sentiments in nationalist societies. And another theory says that there can be a bottom-up process. What we have here is both. We have here very, very intensive incitement, open incitement. I mean, so open that it's landing all of the leadership of Israel in The Hague, right? The list of quotes just keeps growing for that kind of incitement. But when we look at the numbers and we see that there is I'm sorry to have to say this, but there is a consistent number of nearly 3/4 to 80% of the Israeli Jewish public who holds extreme unempathetic attitudes. And I don't just mean unempathetic, I mean, aggressive attitudes. And I'll give you a few examples. It's way beyond the leadership, because we know that this government is not supported by a majority of Israelis. It never was. 48.3% voted for them. In current survey research, they're getting somewhere in the lower to mid 40% range, right? They're getting 50 to 54% of parliamentary seats out of 120. And so it's not the government. When you have 82% of Israeli Jews who told the Penn State researcher Tamir Solek that they support expelling Palestinians from Gaza, when you have 79% in an August survey from the Israel Democracy Institute who said they are not personally troubled by the reports of starvation in Gaza, 74% in the most recent Accord survey who said we don't believe there are any innocents in Gaza from the Jewish population, right? All of this from the Jewish population. 2/3 of Jews in the an Israel Democracy Institute survey from June who oppose more humanitarian aid to Gaza. This is way beyond what this government with minority support can generate. And that's because we have an entire society-wide system of reinforcing the attitudes that explain that, 2/3 to 80%, but very often close to 80% who have these aggressive attitudes. And it goes back to, when you say the media, the free, is there really free media? I think it's, the media is a reflection of the society they live in. Right? They're speaking the same language of their audience. The correspondents and the editors are part of that audience themselves. Israel has a long history of media reinforcing the state narrative, not out of a conspiracy, but out of conviction. And it was in the early days of the state, it was an actual self-censorship body called the editorial committee. But, the committee doesn't have to be there for the spirit of, supporting the general Israel side of the matter to exist. And one of the interesting ways this manifests itself is that for all the criticism we see of the war at home and the numbers that we just talked about, if anybody from abroad dares say, how is Israel behaving like this? Israeli society immediately has an answer. They're just anti-Israel, or they're just anti-Semitic. Okay, so there's a disconnect between how Israelis themselves feel about the war and their resistance to any criticism from the outside and dismissal. It's just anti-Semitism. By the same logic, the idea that Israel is purposely committing any crimes, even the prime minister's apology for bombing the hospital today is nothing more than an implicit justification for every previous bombing of a hospital for the last 2 years. But Israelis will say, you see, we don't mean to do those things. Starvation in Gaza? Certainly not our fault. We don't want that to be the case. And we have all sorts of justifications for why it's not the truth. Hamas is stealing the aid. A photograph in the New York Times didn't tell the whole story. One photograph, right? We know about starvation for a year already in Gaza. 47% of Israelis in a Ma'ariv survey said they didn't even believe that there was starvation in Gaza. And that's because I have yet to hear one Israeli correspondent or commentator In any Israeli mainstream news outlet, other than if you consider Haaretz mainstream, but in any Israeli mainstream news outlet, I have yet to hear any correspondent refer to the hunger crisis in Gaza. All they refer to is Hamas's hunger campaign about Gaza. Every single time it comes up, it's Hamas's hunger campaign. So when you have such a total, media environment, it's not just media, it's the entire social discourse. Again, I'm wary about, saying, oh, this media is conspiring. No, they're just reflecting. And the best thing I can compare it to, and I will stop here for a second, at least for a minute. The best thing I can compare it to is the hermetic information and ideas environment in Putin's Russia today, which justified a war of aggression with Russian public support.
So you're basically saying that, the reality is that what the people in Israel watch on TV is a reflection to it's not being not all the truth is being transmitted, and that's mostly because you want to continue life, and you care less, and it's really hard. And I would say that I would add to the discussion what we feel here in the U.S. Or around the world. Every time we are trying to raise the concern about what's happening in Israel, we are obviously being, even probably this discussion would be considered as anti-Israeli, even though what we are really trying to do is redefine what pro-Israeli means, right? Why we care about. The status of Israel in the world is becoming worse and worse. Today I don't even check what's happening after the bombing of the hospital in Gaza. Asaf, you're actually been interviewed a couple of times in the last 2 weeks, which didn't really happen before, right? Very often in Israeli media on Raviv Drucker's show. When you sit in those panels, do you feel like even the panelists are kind of worried about what you're going to say and if it's going to fit the narrative, or is it something that you feel comfortable sitting down and not worry about what the panelists will say? In a way,
I feel very comfortable sitting there because I think that we have to do the difficult work of talking to the Israeli public, and that goes back to what I said earlier about the difference between the analytic position and the political position. Although I think that the root of the problem is between the combination between, as I said, Jewish and democratic. I think that what we have now is a jihadist turn of Israeli politics, of Israeli Jewish politics, and that we have to have some sort of, people always talk about polarization in Israel, how dangerous the polarization in Israel. I always say that we need to have more polarization in Israel. We need to have constructive polarization in Israel by which we draw the center and left-leaning people towards us rather than towards the right wing, and therefore we have to be on the panels and on the TV shows and whatever. What happens there when I'm there is that they're basically they want to ask me, and again, it's only on Raviv Drucker and maybe Ilana Dayan. They're not part of any by any stretch of the word by the right wing in Israel. But basically, they're interested in what's going on in Gaza. They're not interested on what's going on in Israel vis-a-vis Gaza. So what do the people of Gaza think about Hamas? Do they take out to the streets to protest against Hamas and so on and so forth? And I'm happy to give this information, and I'm happy to add and inform the Israeli public that the people of Gaza hate Hamas, but that doesn't matter for the Netanyahu regime. Whatever happens in Gaza, how ever the people of Gaza detest Hamas because of what they did on the 7th of October and this adventure, this havoc and ruins in which Gaza is in right now. That doesn't matter to the Israeli mainstream politics, and that doesn't matter to the Netanyahu regime, because if it did, we've ended the war. A year and a half ago, we would have ended the war. So I think it's imperative that we do that on Israeli mainstream media, but I think it's more important to streamline the voices of suffering and of death and of extermination in Gaza in those outlets that are independent, because Israeli mainstream media, by and large, do not want to hear anything about Gazans, and that's a huge problem.
I want to take us to the day after Netanyahu. It's hard to imagine, but it will. I mean, this day will come at some point. And I want us to think about this trend, and maybe to talk about what we can do also from here or with Israel, about the trend of extremism, Jewish extremism, and how can we, in a way, I mean, is it even possible to turn it around? I mean, there is two scenarios that I can think of. One is, obviously, we are separating with the Palestinian on the West Bank and on Gaza, and we keep a Jewish majority. Again, not, I mean, it's really defined by, I call it Jewish majority by peoplehood, not by religion in a way, within the Green Line, or whatever left from on the Israel side. And then there is Palestinian side. But there is also the other trajectory, which we keep managing the conflict. And the question is, like, can we keep managing the conflict and stay democracy, which is really hard to see. So I want us to take that, and I want us to, I mean, Dahlia, I want you to, I mean, there is two questions in that sense. What would happen from the American side, or the support from the world, in what to say, if we keep the trajectory the way we are going now? So let's take this from two angles. One is what's happening in Israel, and what will happen in the world.
In the world? Well, I mean, I think the world is a complicated, unpredictable place. And, you know, under President Trump, I don't think there's any way to truly predict what America's position would be. I can tell you where the American public would be. And that is, of course, we know the American public is losing support for what Israel's doing, definitely, including among American Jews. Of course, support is declining for what Israel's doing. They still support Israel in a broader sense, but that support is also heavily differentiated by age at this point. And public opinion in Europe, we also know that in most countries in Europe, there's severely declining public support for Israel. The question is whether that influences policy. I mean, none of this truly matters unless governments take action that will change Israel's direction. And it's, you know, anything that is at the level of rhetorical condemnations, as tough as they may have gotten over the last couple of years, if they don't actually constrain Israel's activities, Israel's not going to change course, which is why what Germany has done is actually quite different from everything else that came before, or any other country that has limited in any way, you know, some sort of.
Can you elaborate on what Germany did?
Yeah. Germany has decided that it's ending its exports of arms that are to be used in Gaza. And this is a real game changer. It's generating a huge controversy in Germany, including within the party of the chancellor. But it's also already having an effect on Israel's capacity, including especially even for the preparations right now to expand this attack in Gaza. Germany was Israel's second biggest supplier of arms. 30% of Israeli arms of Israel's imports come from Germany. The number one, of course, is the US. Number three of all things is Italy, tiny percentage. But, you know, this does have an impact. And whether you support that or not, I don't see any scenario in which Israel changes its course of action based on further condemnations, no matter who those condemnations come from, the Security Council and the General Assembly in the United States and whatever else. So I think that the world, it depends on the world, what those different countries decide to do. By the way, I have significant doubts that a sanctions policy will truly change Israel's course of action, because sanctions have tended not to work in most other countries where they've been applied, including extremely severe sanctions of the kind that Israel has never had to even dream about. What countries tend to do if they are rogue regimes, which Israel is becoming a rogue regime, what they tend to do is simply find other trading partners who aren't concerned by the policies, or, you know, the people end up suffering for it, and then the public becomes embittered, not against their government, but against the outside world that's doing it. So it's very complicated to think about what this will actually mean. And that's all before we talk about the historic factor, which places a severe constraint on many countries even considering the kinds of, you know, punitive policies that they have implemented against other rogue regimes like Russia, Iran, Venezuela, et cetera. So we're not going to see those kinds of things because of Israel's status in the world. And so I think it's, you know, troubling to consider. But I mean, let me just go back to the overall point. There can be no conflict management and survival of democracy in Israel. And it's only partly for the typical reason that the liberal Israeli left or liberal community in general has thought, right? Typically, the liberal or left-wing Israeli community says, we won't be a democracy because we'll be losing our demographics, right? We'll be half Palestinian and half Jews, and that's the reason. No, I mean, yes, that's a reason. If you want to have a Jewish society, you would need to argue that there's some basis in the demos for justifying that. But the deeper reason, as I see it, probably I would say this is by far the most important reason, is that you cannot have the same institution implementing a non-democratic authoritarian military dictatorship, which is what it's becoming, or regime, whatever you want to call it, and at the same time, the same institution trying to implement a democratic system for some of its citizens. By definition, that is not a democracy. And by definition, the same institutions will implement the same undemocratic policies on the erstwhile citizens of a democracy. So by that logic, it was never sustainable. Yes, the collapse was slow, but we are seeing it now. And what worries me is people's failure to see it like that.
Okay.
I think we have to understand the magnitude and the irreversibility of what we've been doing in Gaza so far. I mean, even if right now, as we speak, the last Israeli soldier would have left Gaza, Gaza is in ruins. There is no Gaza anymore. And this will have an impact for Palestinians in Gaza, of course, but also in the West Bank and Israel forever. And I don't see any scenario of Gaza, not even, I mean, not to mention returning to the previous, life that they had in Gaza, but that it's not ending in some sort of ethnic cleansing, because what we're already seeing in Gaza is ethnic cleansing, and the ruins that will leave in Gaza in the future will have to end somehow in ethnic cleansing. I mean, people, concentrating in a very, very tiny area of what used to be Gaza, which was very dense to begin with, or leaving Gaza after Israel finishes what it's doing there, leaving Gaza to other countries, or, the Trump administration buys Egyptian consent, or Jordanian consent to host Palestinians or a number of Palestinians from Gaza for the foreseeable future. And I think that we have to understand first that we have, as Israeli Jews, we have the moral obligation to deal with what we did in Gaza and to take responsibility for what we did in Gaza. That means to take part of in the reconstruction of Gaza in the future. Obviously, be stopped from doing ethnic or another set or round of ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. But also, and I will finish here, and it will probably, if we have time for a Q&A, I'm not sure, but I don't think, and I think that Dahlia is a part of a homeland. Remind me of the name.
A land for all.
Land for all, yeah. One homeland for two people.
2 states, 1 homeland, yeah.
2 states, 1 homeland. I think we don't believe anymore that the 2-state solution, Oslo model of the 2-state solution, is applicable anymore or viable anymore between Israelis and Palestinians, or between Jews and Palestinians, between the river and the sea. We're bound to be together. We're independent. Israelis and Palestinians, or Jews and Palestinians, and that would be the future of Israel and Palestine in the foreseeable future. And what's happening in Gaza is only the last brick in the fall of the 2-state solution. We have to think about alternative solutions. That means that Jews and Palestinians are here and are independent of each other, and we Israeli Jews have to take responsibility for what we've been doing to the Palestinians, at least since 1967, if not since 1948. And we need to take responsibility, and we need to take responsibility for reconstruction, and we need to take responsibility for the well-being of Palestinians and the West Bank and future in Gaza. So that's my message.
So I'll take this and ask the last question, then that came, I think, a couple of questions that came from the audience. I will try to combine them into one because we are running out of time. So you just mentioned the two-state solution and the idea that maybe we are past this solution. So to your point of view, the announcement that may be coming in September from the outside world about a Palestinian state is wrong in many ways, or is it actually a good, positive way both for Israelis and Palestinians?
Well, it's a positive way only in the sense that it might, in very specific circumstances, prevent Israel from continuing what it's doing in the West Bank. Again, Gaza is done. But do you see any scenario in which, as Dahlia mentioned, in which talk and declarations prevent the Israeli Jewish jihadism from continuing what it's been doing in the West Bank? The West Bank is not viable for a Palestinian state anymore. There is no place for building a Palestinian state in the West Bank anymore. And if we have some sort of a Trump plan, deal of not the century, deal of the millennium, whatever, to have some sort of Palestinian state, there will be it will be some sort of Palestinian self-rule, scattered municipalities in the West Bank with no Gaza in sight. So what state are we even talking about?
Yeah. That's good open questions to almost end with. But I will take another question that comes from the audience, and it's actually focusing on Asaf mentioning that not everyone in Gaza is that there is many people in Gaza that are against Hamas. And it sounds like those stories, by the way, are not just traveling, not in Israel, but not also traveling in the world in many ways. Dalia, I mean, when you are talking to people outside of Israel, I mean, like, do you sense that people are aware of Palestinian resistance to Hamas, or not?
I mean, not tremendously, but it's also not really the conversation. I will say that from public opinion, just to give you a little bit of data grounding in what Asaf is saying, I mean, Hamas was not very popular before October 7th. They were declining in popularity. I mean, there's been ups and downs over the course of the last 16 years before 2023 when the siege started, but they had been at a kind of a low point before October 7th. Typically, during each war with Gaza, support for Hamas goes up, and the Palestinian narrative, at that time was like, this was a military act of resistance, challenging Israel. We don't believe those stories about atrocities. I hope everybody on this call realizes that it's a mirror image of how Israelis are denying starvation right now. And so support went up at first, but by the way, support tripled in the West Bank to 45%. That's how low it was before. Support only barely rose in Gaza, even in those first couple of months, right? So just by a few percentage points. And over the course of the last year and a half, support has then been incrementally declining for Hamas. Now, there's difficulties doing, exact assessments. Different surveys with different samples come up with different results. The trend is always downward at this point. And it's a question of whether you see that Hamas has 30% support or 8% support, depending on which survey you're looking at. In addition to data, we have activities on the ground. We've seen waves of protests, sometimes very, mobilized protests against Hamas. And they are, of course, Hamas does as best they can to try to suppress them. And in fact, nevertheless, Israel has developed this narrative, which I think, when you ask about abroad, people's views break down based on where they are with relation to Israel. And so what Israelis say, which is mirrored abroad, is, well, if they really don't like Hamas and if they're not complicit, why don't they rise up and throw Hamas out? Which is a historical thing to say when you think about it. Because I can't think of very many examples at all where a population in the situation of Palestinians in Gaza, under an authoritarian, theocratic leadership who are completely isolated with 45% unemployment before October 7th. Now it's over 90%, of course, had anything like the possibility of mobilizing to throw out their leadership. Look at the Iranian population. They've risen up many times, unable to throw out their leadership. So, the idea that somehow they would just do that magically, we still can't do it after 2 years. But nevertheless, Palestinians are somehow complicit. So these are the kinds of things that I think Israelis have made themselves see about Gaza. And when you ask about abroad, the attitudes abroad really just break down based on where they are with relation to Israel. I have to say that, other than the pro-Palestinian movements, on campuses and some cities where people are demonstrating, I still think this is going, into the speculative territory. It's my speculation that most of the attitudes abroad are primarily determined by how people think about Israel before they prioritize the true experiences of Palestinians. And whether they like or dislike Israel is going to affect really what their position on the Palestinians. I mean, maybe that's just it's complete speculation. I don't have any, evidence-based support for it other than my, impressions. So that's how I think the world is dealing with Israel.
Okay. So before we close, I'll move to Shimrit that will have a last question and closing. And we are above time, so thank you for staying with us. Shimrit, go ahead.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you so much, Asaf and Dahlia. I'm following closely on both of you, and it helps me so much to get so much information. And I think I'm waking up in the morning here and see Asaf's post from Gaza, and my heart is breaking. And then I'm thinking, okay, what we can do from here. And in terms of what we hear from you, we know that the situation is really far away from being something that, we know where we are going from here and what kind of silver linings we can find. But I do want to ask you in connection to what we're doing here at Unacceptable, if you see any hope with the protests out in the streets that are now calling against the war and connecting it with the struggle for the hostages. I want to get your perspective on this resistance on the streets.
Dahlia,
Asaf?
you want to begin?
I mean, all I can say is, the answer is it's the right thing to do. Do Israelis believe that it will make the change? Mostly no. Whenever I talk to people, at protests, even when there were, 500,000 people on the streets, people still say they don't feel a sense of euphoria. They feel like it's probably not going to change things, but they need to go anyway. Now, that's from their perspective. From my perspective, I wish, and I'm very alarmed that there's not more of a connection between ending the war and stopping and eventually reversing, the complete destruction of Gaza that Asaf has talked about. But that's the reality. They're not there. Nevertheless, anybody advocating to end the war for any reason is on the right side of history.
I totally agree. I will add one thing that I read, hear from friends and acquaintances from Gaza. They say to me, sometimes they even write publicly, that what they see in Israel in terms of hundreds of thousands in the last case of people taken out to the streets protesting against the war and against the Netanyahu regime is a source of inspiration for them. And this is extremely important because first it brings back some sort of vague solidarity between Gazans and Israelis, and see people from both sides learning and understanding that there are people, innocent people from both sides that want to end this war. And second, that it in some cases it encourages them to take out to the streets too and protest against the war and against Hamas and so on. Although we cannot expect them to do things like that, because it's a cruel regime, and second, they're really starved to death, and we cannot expect the Gazan people to do those things that the Israeli people are capable of. But it's very important, and I think it's flexing the muscles of civic protest in Israel, and it will be extremely important for the future of getting rid of the Netanyahu regime.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this is so inspiring what you said about what you're hearing from Gaza. I think it's an inspiration for all of us who are protesting. And I just want to end with saying, first of all, thank you so much, Asaf and Dahlia, for being here. It was so meaningful and important to hear your perspective and learning from you. And it educated all of us on where we are at and what we can do from here. And to all of you who joined us today, I know that, again, this is not the most encouraging times, and the news keeps coming are extremely, extremely depressing. And still, what we say are unacceptable, that it's on us too, on this side of the ocean, to act and do whatever we can in support of these voices resisting the government and calling against the war and choosing human lives and humanity. And we want to encourage you to really, I think when we sit at home and watching the news or just listening, it can be really depressing. So please come and join us to look for local protests and events. It's so meaningful. And as you heard from Asaf, people in Gaza watching the Israelis, and I know from our friends in Israel, they're watching us, and it gives them strength that we're supporting their actions from here. So let's keep doing it together and strengthen our brothers and sisters in Israel. And we hope that together this voice will become a meaningful voice to amplify this resistance to the war and help moving things forward. So thank you again. And we really, really hope that, we can help move things forward with everything you're doing and the protesting doing in Israel.
Yeah.
And we hope for better days.
Thank you very much.
all.
Thank you for
Thank
having
you.
us.
I put a link for the Thursday meeting with Dr. Udi Levy about the relationship with Qatar, Hamas, and Netanyahu and follow the money. So that will be a Thursday meetup or Zoom. And as Shimrit said, I mean, like, it's up on us too. And we are keep fighting for saving Israeli democracy and figure it out in some way. So thank you, Dalia. Thank you. And thank you, Regina, and Janet for translating to Spanish. And we'll see you soon again. Be good.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you very
Thank you,
much.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.